Hello. Today I'd like to talk about something, again, near and dear to my heart, but I think it's a topic that a number of people might find useful for reasons basically coming from their childhood. And the topic would be, are some afraid to make mistakes, or are they afraid to make the same ones over and over again? So, we hear all the time, take a risk, act on something, trust yourself, trust your gut feeling, be willing to make mistakes and learn from them. So, if we've heard all this and it makes a lot of sense, then why do some of us, you might ask, not take risks? Why do we feel we perhaps can't learn from mistakes even? The phrase "learn from your mistakes" sounds so nonchalant, but is it really that easy? For instance, this comes from personal experience in my life where my first major job was in the military. And unfortunately, for whatever reasons, I found the job very difficult. And I was told by the person I worked for that, amongst other things, I didn't learn from my mistakes. How interesting. This frustrated him to no end. That while he wouldn't give details, apparently I was making the same mistakes over and over again, or making a lot of mistakes. But to clarify what I just said, he didn't say this specifically, but that I was making perhaps the same few mistakes over and over again. But he wouldn't elucidate what those few mistakes were. Now, I can see, looking back on things from the present vantage point, why he wouldn't specify the few mistakes I was making over and over and over again. But my point being, and a major part of this talk, is that it's become more and more clear to me that when we say to ourselves we're afraid of making mistakes, I think what really is usually the issue is that some of us don't seem to be very adept at learning from our mistakes. And then the question would be, well, why not? Either, perhaps, two scenarios, that there are so many different types of ways to make mistakes that we simply haven't written them down and learned from them and then reviewed. So we just keep making mistakes because we haven't had enough school of hard knocks yet to learn what to avoid, so to speak. But I rather think, looking back on everything and looking at people around me, that what usually is the case is that we tend to make the same few mistakes, or one mistake, over and over and over again. But we don't see this so often, that there's a pattern here to our mistakes, and that perhaps they're the same one mistake or the same two mistakes, over and over and over ad infinitum. So, for instance, what about someone who gets married and has a very difficult time of it in the marriage? So often, perhaps a woman might marry a man and suffer domestic violence, and at some point in time secure an exit from that situation. Perhaps even with legal intervention. but then at some future time may wish to marry again, and as so often seems to be the case, she may marry badly again, and then again and again. And the question then being, are all men bad? Or did she just fail to spot red flags because she didn't write them down and learn how to spot bad men? Or is there something more going on here? Is she making the same mistake over and over due to what I would call perhaps the crux, and that is some form of limiting belief? You might have even called it in past times or in certain circles a certain delusion that's held on to. The definition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders being a firmly fixed belief that is not alterable by evidence that is quite overwhelming. So what would be then the limiting belief here, or delusion, the fixed belief that is very hard to correct and jettison? You could say it's due to organic brain disorder, that there's something wrong with your brain. And that was, and perhaps somewhat still is, talked about by some professionals as being the case in some instances. But I rather think, looking back on my life and looking around to the lives of some others, that there's something quite different going on here. And what is going on is, in my mind, typically a denial of something very fundamental that's very painful to admit and see. So, this could get very detailed, but I see in this world perhaps 4 or 5 basic denials that we so often want to have in our lives. They're very expedient, very comfortable. But the one I see some people getting into hot water in the most, and perhaps the most difficult to unroot, is the denial of human nature, or more specifically, the human nature of some people versus the human nature of others. Now, Robert Greene, a writer of some note, has written books like The 48 Laws of Power and on human nature. And he has said very specifically that understanding human nature is one of the most important things you can do or achieve in your life. But he doesn't go on to specify in excruciating detail what he's talking about. But I would say that to have to wrap your head around this concept is very difficult if you've suffered what you might call abuse in childhood. And by that I specifically mean 2 types, more over and abundant than any others, and that is violence, physical violence, or sexual abuse. And there was a book once that I read about 3 or 4 years ago that totally illuminated my mind or set me on a new path. And the title of the book was Thou Shalt Not Be Aware, by a former psychoanalyst from Europe, perhaps written in the 1980s. And she said, and this was specifically geared almost entirely to sexual abuse, but that so often those who have been sexually abused deny it for reasons of protection, basically. And then that this gets perpetuated into their adult life. To elucidate further, I remember being told by a social worker once that he worked with many women who had had sexual abuse, let's say rape, and he said on average it took the woman a year to realize sometimes that she had even been raped, at least to come to grips with it on a conscious level. Well, I'm not so sure a therapist is totally up to snuff if it takes a client a year to come to that point. But in therapy, but at any rate, the point being that there must be something very powerfully acting on some people. Very terrifying to recognize that this kind of scenario, this abuse, not only happened in the past, but could possibly happen again. And likewise, what about physical abuse, violence? I see all too often that people who have been physically hurt in childhood tend to want to deny it and even idealize the source, the parent usually, or some family member outside of the immediate circle, and to make this parent into an idealized saint of sorts. So I find this very interesting that this can then easily perpetuate into adulthood in both scenarios. Now, of course, this can take on other aspects too, like generally denial of human nature when it comes to some people wanting to be what you might call users or sociopathic or scheming, whereby we might then want to deny that such people exist and kind of have a whitewashed picture of everybody as basically honest, law-abiding citizens. But I think behind that kind of idea tends to be the limiting belief, if you will, of denying these two basic elements of talking about, depending on one's experience in childhood, of either denial of sexual harm or physical harm, because the idea of it happening again as an adult is so frightening that one, for whatever reasons, can't deal with it on the mental level. And so there's a denial going on. Now, I find it very interesting what a psychologist once told me of some repute. He told me that the only difference between his clients and himself personally is that all his clients were naive. But he never elucidated, he never explained that. But it all kind of fits for me now. What he meant, in my opinion, is that so many of his clients were denying what I'm talking about, denying human nature in some people with respect to either violence or their desire to act out on their sexual desires in very inappropriate ways. And his clients not being able to see this over and over and over due to a denial, basically, of the nature of some people. Now, there's a term that I find very interesting. I don't know how colloquial it is or whether it's much embraced in psychiatric circles, but Stockholm Syndrome. For instance, there's a video on YouTube talking about how many people, perhaps who have been abused in childhood, could well have Stockholm Syndrome. And by Stockholm Syndrome, I'm no expert on all of this, but perhaps it entails a denial and idealization then of very abusive people in your adult life. And then I suppose you would be called naive in a sense, a very profound sense. And in denying this nature of some people, make the same few mistakes over and over and over again by being gullible, so to speak. Now, while not getting too nitpicky or technical or trying to structure this too tightly, I've seen a general progression in some people who've struggled with these issues. That in many people there's a denial of the human nature of some people. And then in some instances followed by some kind of aha moment or awakening that some of these people really do exist. But then what? What, for instance, of a woman who kind of gets a clue, so to speak, that some men are very violent or very sexually abusive? Well, sometimes, unfortunately, this can easily flip into a mode where all people are bad. Whereas before, the denial was the sort that all people are good, and therefore one doesn't have to fear at all. This can sometimes flip into a protective mode of, aha, I see what's going on now with some people, but I'm going to take care of myself and protect myself by declaring all people bad. And then, for instance, with some women who have suffered sexual abuse, they may declare that all men are bad and never want to date again, never want to marry. They may join certain groups that feel very toxic toward men and militate toward men. In some instances, they may become lesbians out of a misconception that all men are not worth associating with, and so maybe they figure, what other option do I have for warmth and closeness and love? Now, I would say, in other cases, or as an adjunct, then this can lead to isolation. And then what about step 3, perhaps, where one starts to say, well, maybe not all people are bad and maybe not all are good. I'll try and sort this out and identify who the bad and the good are. Which I think is a very noble and progressive step on this process of growth. And so, unfortunately, in identifying then who violent people are or who sexually abusive people are in our adult lives, what sometimes all too often happens in this process or this step is a desire for either revenge against these people, but also catastrophizing, followed by what you might call paranoia or paranoid personality disorder, depending on what terms you want to use. But in my estimation, I don't like using these terms. They're very stigmatizing and imply kind of biological conditions going on that I don't think generally exist at all. And I love the word catastrophizing. So then a step being that it is an involvement in my mind to be able to identify the good from the bad, so to speak. But then what? To cower and cringe? But why? I see all too often because of catastrophizing. Let's say catastrophizing a rape, followed by perhaps pregnancy or some sexually transmitted disease, or the incurring of stigma or shame. All of these issues can be very catastrophized, as though it's not only the end of the earth, but equivalent to eternal punishment. Let's say in fiery flames forever for the next few trillion years. Versus keeping it perspective that whatever happens not only is going to end the impact thereof at death in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, not a trillion years, but also that sometimes there's silver linings to all of this. Silver linings to being raped and even becoming pregnant and having a child that you hadn't wanted. Or the silver lining of being physically injured. And so, all of these issues being sometimes all too often catastrophized. It not helping that the media all too often loves to blow some of these things into the frontline headlines all the time and repeat this over and over and over to the point that that too helps us keep this in a catastrophizing mentality and not in perspective. Indeed, I can give you a very quick synopsis of one aspect of my childhood, and that was whereby I was often very bullied. For whatever reasons. My being excruciatingly thin and tall for one thing, with no muscularity, didn't help at all. Plus, having come from a largely immigrant family, I was in some ways very different than many children amongst me who were not immigrants or of immigrant background. But at any rate, this an interesting thing about the bullying was that what was much worse than the bullying was the shame of having been bullied once my parents found out. For instance, I would typically report, so to speak, the bullying that had happened to me to my parents. And interestingly, I received an incredible amount of shame, particularly from one of my parents, of the nature of, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you give as good as you got? Why didn't you punch them in the face or do this or that? Why did you allow it to happen? So, this then I think could be quite analogous to the struggles some suffer from sexual abuse, whereby sometimes perhaps the shame is worse afterward from being put upon them than the rape itself or the aftermath physically. Again, questions of, why did you let it happen? Or, you must have wanted it to happen. Which then can get very confusing too, of course. Questioning one's very intense. But at any rate, again, catastrophizing things not only on the apparent outcome to oneself, but due to shame issues coming afterward from what's placed upon us by some others. Now, I would say at this point that I've seen in a number of people, a great number of people, a considerable number, that they've come to the point, perhaps even in childhood, of recognizing differences in human nature and unfortunately catastrophizing certain outcomes, and so the result being that in these people's lives, not isolating, but instead what I might call building a fortress mentality. And what I mean by that then is reacting not by isolating, but by building an incredible amount of arsenal of weapons or allies, or you might say having a fortress or compound mentality, whereby certain people are declared in a sense enemies, almost even evil, and extraordinary measures taken to prevent possible calamity that so often happen to them in childhood, and they're quite adamant they don't want it to happen again. But behind all this, I see then the issue again of catastrophizing possible outcomes. Not denial, which some are using, but catastrophizing followed by a fortress mentality on the other hand. So, this can, of course, lead to things like excessive collecting of guns or a desire for, on a nationwide level, the building of nuclear arsenals way beyond what is necessary, out of catastrophizing. So then, I see the final level of growth, perhaps, in all of us, being a concept of spirituality of some sort, either of the Western view or the Eastern view, typically the Buddhist view, whereby, perhaps in the West, one says that no matter what happens, I will be rewarded for my suffering, and it will be over someday, and things will be quite different. Or in the Eastern perspective, although they have this sort of idea too, with reincarnation, I think there's a lot of emphasis in the East on acceptance. For instance, I was very pleased to see some videos a year or two ago by a man in India named Anubkov, who has a show called Spirituality Stop. That's the name of his YouTube channel. And the main theme of his videos is acceptance of whatever happens. And there's another Buddhist man from Australia, centered in Perth. And he talks somewhat along these lines too, of the importance of fearlessness. But at any rate, in both cases, the idea being that through some kind of spirituality, this may be the best solution to the alternatives of either denial or a fortress mentality, as I call it, whereby in both cases something is catastrophized as so horrible that we either want to deny it or let's say isolate as a midway strategy, or build a fortress so that a gnat couldn't come through a screen, so to speak, and then feeling somewhat protected of a sort, but a very unstable protection, whereby one is always somewhat worried, somewhat queasy, never sure. I think the ultimate solution is through some sort of spirituality, because then, no matter what happens, this is probably the optimal way of dealing with something we can never guarantee could be avoided. And as for denial is not a fixed, firm thing. There's always going to be periods in my mind where something will break through to consciousness as per certain elements being toxic in our society or in the world in general. And so, the upshot being then that not only do we have to worry and somehow reconcile our nature as being finite and dying, but reconcile injury too, that might result in pain before death, and perhaps chronic pain. And part of this chronic pain perhaps being shame that we incur from injuries or other suffering. So to recap and clarify just a little more, I would say that in my mind, perhaps some of us are afraid of making mistakes and then not acting thus on ideas, hunches, intuition, our logic, what we observe, what we most care about. Not because we're really afraid of making mistakes, but because in the back of our mind, perhaps unconsciously somewhat, we have an inkling that we're going to make the same few mistakes over and over. From past experience, we know that furthermore, we can't seem to stop this cycle. That in essence, we're compelled to make the same mistakes over and over again. And this bugs us so much, especially when we can't see this pattern, that we just tell ourselves on a conscious level that somehow we don't want to make mistakes, but we don't know why and what's exactly going on here. From another example, totally unrelated to abuse issues, I would say, for instance, wouldn't it be interesting if we were telling ourselves, if we smoke or drink too much or gamble, that we keep making the same mistake over and over again when we do this? But is this a mistake to light up again when we said the day before we wish we wouldn't, and perhaps have set some kind of resolve in action, only to go back the next day and do it again? Is this a mistake we keep making? Or is it a compulsion born of some way of dealing with something underneath the surface that's very frightening? In this case, not a denial, but a distractive mechanism, or a way of feeling good to soothe us somehow. But the same idea being, in all these cases, perhaps the bottom line being that we are compelled because it seems to be the most expedient and easiest way of doing things, to reckon with severe fear, severe anxiety. So the point being that these compulsions of a sort, then, to either deny or to distract ourselves, aren't really mistakes, are they? Or they're not even the same mistake repeated over and over, or the same one mistake, but a form of not reckoning with something there under the surface that frightens us very much. And once this starts to burst through, we have to start reckoning this, what to do with it. And in my mind, the ultimate solution being some form of acceptance of what is, of what can't be changed. I hope this is somewhat helpful. It's been a long time coming for me, from a lot of personal experience and having seen up front such matters in the lives of some others around me. And this kind of thing doesn't get resolved overnight, I know. But I hope this is what I love to say, good food for thought. And I wish you well.